We'll see when they come on if they can hear people. How was your guys' journey?
It was fine. Yeah, I moved. Yeah, moved. Walking around the block. It's last night.
Yeah.
Friday is supposed to be.
Why could it be?
Well, you're right. Yeah, I mean, that's just. Yeah. I don't know. PEI cards. And so just, I was in some. Yeah.
Oh, you said the conference room was that?
I'm not sure if I caught that. I gave you that. Oh. Looks like it just. It's.
Yeah, and if we need anything, we just call or dial 333 on the phone.
Great. Okay.
Oh, wait.
Is there a password? Oh, it's just.
Yeah.
That's their position.
I was like, well, we said, trust me. It's good to shake things up.
Yeah, for sure.
That's great. I'm beginning where I came from. I first moved back down, so. That's. It's really cool starting.
Yeah.
Basic out there.
Yeah, understatement. Yeah, no, get her there, Ken. The better
Shit.
yeah, straight for her, straight for her. Yeah.
You make choices for wrong reasons.
Yeah, no, and she's been manager and.
Yeah.
New experiences, new things, new challenges, yeah. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, well, our little team is feeling a little headless. Just a few weeks. She left, because we don't really have a plan resolved. So.
I just gotta stay calm for now.
Yeah.
So.
Good to see you.
Regular.
Yeah, she's staying here, working from home. So.
Oh, is she? Good for her. I know.
And we hope it has opened up opportunities that we wonderful. Yeah.
I could see people moving something that they didn't want, they're not gonna fit.
Yeah, and if this is home, and you can do it from anywhere. Yeah. You never would have considered that 3 years ago.
No.
Yeah.
It's not the separation now. Hard to get back, I think, gone home and work well.
Yeah.
Comfort. And I think one of the things there too. It's good. Good seeing you again. Take care.
And yeah.
Not long, we're still in boring period.
Okay, yeah, so actually, the day Queen died was her last day. Yes,
We definitely had that moment though, like, oh, this is just all happening.
yeah, I'm sorry, I don't know. Like I'm.
Yeah.
No, it was which.
So it's probably the net zero work.
Yeah.
So the climate change teams are kind of split in government. There's the net zero team and they do all mitigation and stuff, kind of on purpose on.
Okay, yeah, so this is,
Yeah, like Derek Ellis.
yeah.
Very
You have people. Oh, yeah. Hi there.
No guarantees, Hope. How are you?
Are you?
Good, thank you.
I went to facilities for coming here to this stock conference. Yeah. I saw someone say it's pretty heavy, like heavier story.
Yeah. Drive back to episode from March.
You're not gonna regret.
No.
Right, they're gonna get the worst of.
Yeah. Yeah, Dorian, I don't know how's Dorian in PEI? You guys are chartered, yeah.
That would, yeah, wasn't like, starters were, yeah, just like they're like, starters a lot of order.
Okay.
But again,
Yeah, we had so many trees down in Halifax. And I don't know if you guys remember the crane. There was a crane that was like in operation, but they didn't have time to put it down. And it hit the building that, it was like building up. Yeah, it took months to get it fixed. Yeah.
you be in Halifax then, or?
Yes.
Okay, it's better, safer to bring the little out of the bath or do it?
I don't know, I would tell, to be honest, like, we're in like down in Halifax worst. Things because there's a lot more trees that are close to power lines. Urban space. Yeah. I'm happy enough by the way,
Oh, it's, yeah, that,
but that,
include.
we go,
Beautiful.
oh, you know,
Right.
probably have name tags for everybody.
Sure.
Donna. How you doing? Daniel. You Stratford again, eh?
Some of my texts.
Yeah.
Keep on.
Good one.
I believe how quickly our use was drawing.
Actually, I didn't know. It's pretty strong for us. School board. Municipal. Next year, it's going to be provincial and quite likely federal. So the list of candidates seeking office is very small. They're done.
Adaptation.
Probably been down there. So you can't kind of, sure, we want to see. Show them.
To be really
Well, we need ballpark candidates. A lot more than thought it should be. I'm on the wall on that issue. Yeah.
Yeah, no, and I think.
People are saying. Exactly. You know.
Everybody goes down, rolling down.
Bruce. Get in there. Boy, if this is. What's the word on your end? It's a lot of people to be off. The one announcement.
Yeah.
Yeah, a lot of people.
Okay.
How we doing?
The AGM. Yeah. Yeah, well, no one's seen anyone in person for. Yeah. Yeah. It's a different time. And that happens much now. I still work from home. It's my usual location, but you know, when I have to actually do an in-person meeting, I'm like, actually, it's not just walking down the hall to the boardroom.
No, see this. Yeah, yeah, that's right. Yeah. It's working great with some people.
Yeah.
Some companies. So it's like anything else, people would do. Good.
I'm probably.
Morning, Janelle. Still on mute.
How's your audio on your side?
Good, I can hear you well.
Okay, okay, good, good. No, just waiting for Lori. I thought it allow people in automatically, because I thought I clicked that, but I guess not.
Oh, okay, yeah, no, it's still making a lobby where you have to admit everyone, yeah.
Yeah.
Are things there good?
For me?
Are things going there so far good?
So far, so good, yeah, yeah.
I think the 49 probably more
Yeah.
but they said the same that recording is super so. Experience free of Oh, yeah. It's not.
Good stuff, yeah. You're here? You're here.
Thanks.
Clearly haven't fulfilled this. Go ahead. Coffee on the way. Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Danelle. Hey, Danelle. Just saw a message from Lori that she's waiting in the lobby as well.
Yeah, I just clicked it there. This is our text.
Awesome.
All good?
Oh. Yeah. You can do your. Yeah.
That's right. So, I learned that.
I think it's, yeah. That it takes a while to yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm well. Even though he's our hero. It's like you've been yeah. I don't get either just have Wi-Fi service or initial or yeah. I like randomly just send messages and timestamp them. Just let them know that we thought of it. We thought about it. And then on like that. So you. Yes. Yeah. Also, yeah. No. So
Yeah.
But this is all they were. Basically. But it's.
Oh, you did.
It's very well. Oh, yeah, yesterday. I had signs or something. Oh, my last. Going into. That's coming up. Slowly, but into retirement. David. Although I keep running with the man. Yeah, yeah. Yeah. That was one that was. I'm ready for the lyric. Be done. Well, I'm interested.
So maybe. Yeah.
All the residents. So. And probably.
In my survey.
Waiting for Danelle from FPEIM to shall be choose from briefly, and she'll be back, but she'll be starting us off and setting stage for us to get started. That's it for now. Not so.
Oh, I share.
So with that, but maybe we can. Good morning, everyone, and welcome. My name is Bruce McDowell. I'm president of the Federation of PEI Municipalities. And I'd like to welcome everyone here this morning. Welcome to the beautiful city of Charlottetown. That's coming from a guy from Somerset, so that's quite a compliment. Before we get started, just want to remind everybody the coffee over here, the washrooms down. Right. Down the end of the hall. Right. We'd like to begin by acknowledging that the land on which we gather is the traditional and unceded territory of First Nation. The Federation of Prince Edward Island Municipalities is pleased to partner with the Clean Foundation and Net Zero Planning to offer this workshop on tools for climate action. Special thanks to Danelle, our community climate advisor, for her work in helping to organize that. We're grateful to have Hope Parnham, Senior Climate Change Adaptation Policy Advisor with PEI Department of Environment, Energy, and Climate Action, and Kathleen Mifflin, Project Manager from Net Zero Atlantic, to share their expertise today. In releasing recommendations on the National Adaptation Strategy, the Federation of Canadian Municipalities noted that municipalities are on the front lines of a new climate extreme. As Hope will discuss this morning, climate change not only affects our island through erosion and flooding, issues we may well face this weekend with Hurricane Fiona. So climate change has even more far-reaching impacts that extend into areas, including our land use planning that extend into areas including agriculture and even healthcare. With climate change and extreme weather events, municipal services such as emergency services, land use planning will become more important. Climate change planning can help municipalities prepare, reduce emissions, build sustainable economies, and create a better overall quality of life for residents. Thank you for dedicating your time to learn more about making your municipality more resilient and sustainable. And hope you have a great day.
A long time since I've been in front of people in person, but faces for me to the tables. My name is Hope Parnham, and I tend to wear a lot of hats when I attend these types of events. Today, I'm here as a representative of the Department of Environment, Energy, and Climate Action. I sit within the climate action team that works primarily on adaptation. We also have a net zero team that works on the mitigation side of things, but you'll find what I'm going to talk about today in this
much more to do with the adaptation side of it, not that mitigation isn't just as important to planning for climate change. I've only been with the government for about 2 years. For the past 15 years, I've been planner, landscape architect, PEI, working with many of your municipalities in different ways, and always with the climate change lens. I'm thinking Dale's probably the only one that saw my thesis presentation 15 years ago, but I actually studied the impacts of coastal flooding on and sea level rise as part of my master's 15 years ago. So I've been doing this for a long time. And so I hope there's not a lot of repetitive stuff in here. What I came to talk today about was really the tools to move forward rather than what is climate change and what are we expecting in terms of productions. So to start my presentation, I was trying to figure out the best way to introduce. Do I need to start with the climate change story or do I start with the planning story? And for most of you in this room, you are already planning municipalities, I think. But I do want to talk about planning from the perspective of it's more than just development control. Because I think that's what's holding a lot of our municipalities back. So I'm going to just have kind of a general planning talk, and then we'll get into the actions through planning that address climate change impacts. Traditionally, we talk about impacts from a hazard base, getting the hurricane, what are we going to do about it to prepare? But we also need to start thinking more broadly in terms of the impacts on our society. And as we heard in the introduction, climate change impacts our healthcare systems, our emergency response systems, our economies, our sectors like fisheries and agriculture, and all of those things impact our municipalities as well. So those are the kind of the three big things I want to talk about today. So to start off, municipalities are required to provide services to their residents, and fire protection, emergency measures planning, and municipal planning are the basic three things that are covered in your Municipal Government Act. The planning piece of it is generally interpreted as you have an official plan and a development control bylaw. And I think that is the first misunderstanding about what municipal planning actually is. If you Google municipal planning rather than land use planning, you'll find a whole slew of services that municipalities are actually supposed to include when they consider what planning actually is. Planning is a consideration of public interest that guides municipal decisions about land, resources, services that create healthy, sustainable communities. You can't just do that through development control. Planning considers the social, economic, and environmental impacts of growth and change. And growth and change are inevitable. So if we all accept that growth and change are going to happen, we can't freeze in time and say we don't want change to happen, whether it's the change of our erosion, coastlines, or change of no further development. We don't want any more traffic on our roads. We're not going to get anywhere in a progressive manner. We need to accept the change is going to happen and work towards doing that in a sustainable manner. So what the Municipal Government Act also gives your municipalities is all these other tools, and enables you to have other bylaws, other regulations, other programs, initiatives, services that you can offer your residents, and the tools that you can use to actually implement your planning policies. So your official plan does guide your bylaw, your development control bylaw, but it also guides your decisions related to all the other tools in your toolbox. So if you're making decisions, whether it's on your budget or whether it's on offering recreational services, all of those types of policies can be built into your official plan because it's your plan for who you want to be as a community. Oh, let's go back. So good planning, not just land use planning. And I'm sure many of you have seen this. This is the provincial government typical slide. It's been around for a while, but I added some climate change ones to the bottom of it. It reduces those land use conflicts, and it's more effective and efficient to offer services because people are clustered. You're not trying to deliver services to a widespread, pocket development all over the place. It's predictability for landowners and for potential landowners, people that are interested in purchasing and developing land. It gives them an idea of what they can expect to happen in their community in the future. It's protection of our natural resources. And it's also just better resilience and preparedness for climate change, because it is a complete community considering all of those factors that will impact us due to climate change. And on the mitigation side, it is also supporting low carbon lifestyles that reduce those greenhouse gas emissions. The consequences of not planning are quite simply the opposite, right? So we have conflicting land uses, we have urban sprawl, urban development, We aren't thinking through the processes of where development is occurring. It's happening based on an on-demand basis, based on permit applications rather than what we want to see happening in our communities. From a climate change perspective, this increases our vulnerability, and it makes us much more dependent on those personal vehicles, which are actually the highest cause of emissions in PEI, is our transportation. So the secret to good or great planning, not just land use planning, is using all of those tools in your toolbox. You can plan policies that have to do with things like initiatives and gathering your communities and organizing volunteer committees to address certain issues that are priorities. You have the ability to change taxes based on different types of development and services received by different properties in your community. You can create secondary plans like your emergency management plan, which is a requirement, but also stormwater management plan, recreation plans, active transportation network plans. You can do all of those things, and all of those together with your land use and your bylaws for development together will lead to a more complete picture of what you're actually trying to achieve as a goal in your community for your official plan. So here's just one example, and I was trying to avoid all the climate hazard stuff, but this one's a hazard. So if what you're hearing from your residents in your community is that one of the main roads in some homes are continuing to experience some flooding during extreme rain events, likely to experience it again this weekend, right? So you're thinking in your head, all right, we've got to address this problem. There's multiple ways you can address it, but first you actually have to acknowledge it that it is a problem. So just including that as a current issue in your official plan, saying we want to do something about it, is an important first step. Then you can adopt policies to address the problem. You want to have new development that is just simply built better. Let's not continue to add to the problem. We want to help those residents that are currently dealing with the problem. And depending on not whether you own your infrastructure, you want to work with the province or work with your public works department to actually address what's the infrastructure problem, right? Those are pretty common sense things. We're not going to add to the problem. We're going to help those that are suffering, and we're going to figure out what it is we can do to actually fix it in the long term. Those are your policies. Your plan actions are how you're actually going to see those policies realized. So we can support the use of stormwater retention ponds, ditches in new subdivisions, for example, instead of trying to pipe everything and have overland flow gathered. We can require stormwater management plans with new development because where they alter the grade, it's redirecting that stormwater flow. We can have incentives for reducing hard surfaces for asphalt or regulations. What go the regulation route. You can have an education campaign on things that people can do to help their homes if their existing homes are susceptible to basement flooding. Rain barrel program, Summerside did that last year. Charlottetown's had one for quite a while. And then you can really put some effort into it. It requires the human resources into seeking funding partnerships to address the infrastructure problems. But that does take capacity to do those things. Notice that there's only one of these actions you would find in a subdivision and development bylaw. All of the other potential actions to address these policies are achieved through other initiatives, other policies, or programs, and other efforts of your municipality. This is where that is for municipality size matters. So if you're thinking to yourself, you can't use those other tools because your capacity is too limited, whether it's financial, human resources, your volunteer capacity, because most of you are functioning on a volunteer council basis. Your service provisions, you just don't offer those other services. Your number of tools in your toolbox are limited because of your size. And that's a different topic of discussion altogether. It will impact your climate vulnerability. And unfortunately, PEI's municipal system isn't helping that. So as I said, different topic for a different day. But capacity matters when it comes to climate adaptation. So my first recommendation of the day is if you're worried about not having those tools in your toolbox, that you can't offer that range of services, you need to start working with your neighboring municipalities. You need to start looking at things from a more regional perspective, because we are tiny and we don't have the capacity. We are smaller than the size of Halifax. So when the federal government has funding for infrastructure, a municipality like Halifax is the size of our entire province, and you guys are all competing for those same funds. Sorry for the bad news to start the day. So let's talk about what you can do. Hopefully, there's a lot of things in here that you can do regardless of size. Climate adaptation, when I got involved in it 15 years ago, we talked about 3 options: you either protect, you accommodate, or you retreat. And those words came right from the top of the International Panel on Climate Change, IPCC reports of how to address climate change impacts. And unfortunately, those 3 things have stayed with us and they're language that we continue to hear. But somewhere along the line, we got stuck on that protection one. Like, we can engineer our way out of these problems and we don't need the other 2 because we can build better, bigger, we can defeat nature. Climate change doesn't have an end date. And eventually all of our protection efforts.
Those 3 things: protect, what was the other 2?
Protect, accommodate, and retreat. And I didn't put them in my slides because I've used those slides too many times in the past and I figured you all have seen them already. Sorry about that. So when we think about hazards, it should be pretty straightforward from a planning perspective. We identify the hazard, the hurricane is coming at us, right? We evaluate the risk. Today, it looks like it's going to hit Cape Breton. We're probably going to get the tail end of it, which is the rainy side of the storm, right? That's our risk that we're facing right now. And then we adapt and change conditions to reduce our vulnerability, right? So depending on what hazard you're looking at, there's different types of risks and different types of response. So a climate hazard, lots of different ones. And I skipped the climate change discussion to start, but I'm going to get into the climate change hazards that the province has identified and kind of walk through a few of the examples. But it's basically defined as a potential damaging event or phenomenon resulting from climate change that would consequently result in major impacts such as loss of life or injury, environmental degradation, infrastructure damage, or social and economic disruptions. And this is Fiona headed our way. So some climate hazards are what we call discrete hazards. They occur over a short period of time. They come, they happen, and then they're done. And the problem, a hurricane isn't a climate change phenomenon. What is a climate change phenomenon is that the hurricanes are happening more frequently and more intense. And it's happening again and again. We're not learning from our lessons. Today, first tweet of the day I saw on Fiona was that this is a once in a lifetime storm that we're about to experience. They said the same thing 3 years ago with Hurricane Dorian, right? So how many once in a lifetime storms come on in do we need before we actually realize that we're in Hurricane Alley, right? We have to start designing better, building better in response to these types of hazards. So the Provincial Climate Change Risk Assessment identified 8 primary climate hazards that they looked at, and 5 of those were considered discrete hazards. We have our coastal hazards, and those are the coastal impacts that happen during the storm itself. So the wave action causes accelerated erosion, and the storm surge, the low pressure system actually elevates the water level, it causes coastal flooding. The post-tropical storm itself is the wind and the rain causing potentially overland flooding. And we can also have extreme precipitation events with or without the post-tropical storm. That's like what did they call them last year? Atmospheric rivers. Yeah, for the first time in summer, right? There's the rain that just blows out of the sky like a river. Extreme heat events are things that we don't talk enough about here. And we love to say, like, oh, wouldn't that be nice to have a bit more heat in summer, right? Like, we all love our hot summer day on the beach. Except we don't design our facilities, our schools to accommodate a heat wave engine. New Brunswick last year had to cancel school in June for the first time in history due to the heat wave. Their schools don't have air. So what did they do? They summer kids home, right? So that's an adaptation to the circumstances of the time. Ice storms and freezing rain. We often don't think about global warming as being a winter problem. But when we don't get our really cold winters, we actually get mild winters that hover around 0 and cause more freezing rain, more freeze-thaw events. Freeze-thaw causes modulus structure damage, right? So, and we also get rain over frozen ground, which causes more overland flooding. So
Your coastal hazards. The erosion problem. Have you considered the ability of saltwater leaking into the freshwater system?
Yeah, so saltwater intrusion is an issue, but it's actually not caused by climate change. It has more to do with overdevelopment.
Okay.
Drawing too much water right up. So that's our discrete climate hazards. Those are our extreme weather events. The ongoing gradual climate hazards is sometimes what we distract ourselves with when we think climate change is a long-term solution, not for today's problems, right? And that's where the coastal hazards are considered the more permanent issue. It's still erosion, but we are going to lose it faster over extended periods of time. And sea level rise is the coastal flooding that's not going to retreat after the storm leaves. Those low-lying lands are going to be flooded permanently. In many cases, those are our existing salt marshes, and where our salt marshes can't move inland, sea level is going to rise, and then the salt marsh will be eliminated, and that's critical vulnerable habitat that should be protected. The other gradual changes are the earlier warmer springs, as well as the warmer winters that I mentioned, and the seasonal droughts, which impact our economy and local communities. So we've got gradual hazards as well as the discrete hazards to respond to. And if only it were so easy for land use planning to just say, let's just not build there, right? If climate hazards were as obvious as an active volcano, we wouldn't build stuff there. But our coastal floodplains only get flooded every once in a while, depending on where that path of the storm hits. We don't know which section of PEI is going to be flooded. During Dorian, it was Crystal Beach Campground, is the picture we all saw in the news. That's because the storm wraps around counterclockwise and buries the ocean water up against the shore, and that storm, it was multi-day. As of right now, the storm is tracking further to the east, and so it's likely to be somewhere else along the North Shore. We don't know yet if it's going to be high tide, but that could be Trackety Bay, that could be Savage Harbor, that could be North Fresca, right? We've got all different bays. We're not sure where the storm surge is going to hit at its peak yet. We all need to be just as prepared. We don't want to take over. Let home not. I thought you were here for rest. No. Okay, so in thinking of how do we evaluate strategies to respond to the hazards from a planning perspective, first we need to identify those risks. So from a coastal hazards perspective, it's like, are you in the coastal zone? That's an easy question to ask, right? When you're looking at a property or a development application or an infrastructure project, that's the first question you ask yourself. Is it in the coastal zone or not? Is it historically prone to flooding, or is it expected to flood in the future? Is it historically prone to erosion? You know, if it is in the coastal zone. Guess what? If you're not in the coastal zone, don't worry about the hazard. Kensington is free and clear of that risk. But if you are, it shouldn't be that difficult to see that you need to have regulations or design standards to address the risk. The risk is there. We all know it. We've been talking about it for 20 years. Let's do something about it. The province released new flood maps 2 years ago for the coastal zone. These flood maps address the current hazard of coastal flooding. We don't know where the storm's going to hit, but depending on where it does hit, these are the potential areas that could get flooded. And I was hoping I get some storm surge numbers to give you today for Fiona, but I don't know. I haven't known yet. It's too early. This is the Hebrides subdivision on the North Shore near New London. And the red area is the area that will flood today if that once in a lifetime storm hits. Right? So we've just been told once in a lifetime storms coming Saturday. We don't know which part of PEI is going to get hit. We all need to prepare. So this is a potential elevation based on that storm we got in early 2000s. It was 2001. Wasn't one, but the other one that had the higher storm surge. Sorry, the name's lost on me. So we know that highest storm surge that PEI's ever had, and we added to high tide, and that's what those floodplains look like. Sure.
Sorry, so on the map there, red zone with all
Yep.
the lots. So can you actually sell those lots?
Yep. Right now, people live on those lots, they're developable, they should be sold. Yes.
I almost bought that one until I started working in municipal government and worked with you for official planning. I almost bought that white house right there in the middle. of
I'm glad I didn't go over it over time. I haven't had enough input, so I'm glad. So I'm so excited to be working with my team that we were able to release these maps publicly. They're online. You can go to the government's social hazards website. You can zoom into any part of PEI and turn on and off the layers. The yellow and orange layers here are the future floodplains. So remember, I was saying a discrete versus gradual hazards. The red is the discrete hazard of a storm happening today. The yellow and orange are where that flood, the same flood would occur to after sea level rise in 2050 or 20. So those are the long-term projections of where that floodplain will get to. The red dash line, it's hard to see here, is actually what we call an extreme storm scenario, and that's because we still have people talking about West Antarctic ice sheet melt, and that sea level rise is going to happen much more extreme than what we're actually planning for. And so that accounts for that added piece of unknown variable, but it's generally considered not within the 2100 horizon of planning. So we've got flood maps. This information is available. It's been available for a year and a half for you all to use in any of your decision making. The first thing you need to do if you're a municipality on the coast is recognize that coastal hazards is a problem. So if you're, recognizing that your community members, your residents, your infrastructure is on the coast, if you recognize it as a problem, then you create policies to address the problems. Just the same as I showed in the example earlier of the overland flooding. So establishing the policies to address the risks or the hazards and adopt regulations for new development, right? We don't want to add to the problem. But you can adopt those regulations and decide how that works in your community. You can also consider the impact of coastal hazards on your emergency management planning. In this case, this road access is gone, right? So evacuation orders if storm surge in places like this may be in order. Yes.
Is this, like in local municipalities, are they still issuing building permits for that red area?
For the most part, they are. Yep. And so is the province.
Okay, and under the real estate photo ethics,
Yep.
or whatever, there's a disclosure rule, you have to disclose information that's available about a property. And do you know if that would be as a normal real estate transaction, if that information would be disclosed to a potential buyer?
Yeah, so we've presented the maps and provided all the tools to the Real Estate Association, PEI. Actually, we've given 2 presentations over the past 6 months, and then one was later or in the fall before we had some supporting tools set up. And we now receive almost daily requests for what we call coastal hazard assessments from real estate agents working in PEI, disclosing flood risk. It's not currently a requirement that as I understand it. In other jurisdictions in Canada, they disclose it right on the realtor.ca website. It's like, click here to see your flood risk. We are trying to encourage them to do that, but it's not regulated through our.
One more, just
Yeah.
I've asked this question before, and I'm not sure if I've ever gotten that clear answer on it. Is there any civil liability or legal precedent in Calgary, that sort of municipalities that issue building permits after this flood for this area, after this floodplain is publicly available?
You're ahead of me.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay.
So here's the thing you can do about it today. If you adopt regulations and limit development, that's one way to go, right? At the very least, disclosure. So there is no precedent of someone trying to sue the municipality or the province for issuing a permit and then them being flooded. We don't know what the legal liability is. I'm not a lawyer, and I've been told I'm not allowed to give liability advice. But what we have been told is that from an ethics perspective, you have a responsibility to disclose risks. So if you're issuing permits in a flood zone, at the very least, you should be disclosing to that person receiving the building permit the information that, do you know that you're in a flood zone? Do you know if you've designed accordingly? People build in Miami all the time, and they flood at high tide. They don't have to wait for the hurricane, right? You can design for flooding. You can design your house on stilts, you can design to not have a basement, you can bring in fill and raise your elevation. There's lots of other ways to address development in a floodplain that isn't just no build up, right? There are other strategies you can use. But federal government guidelines that determine federal funding assistance. So if we get a big storm and you have not designed your house according to the floodplain, you will not get financial assistance. And that's as of a year and a half ago when the province released these floodplains. So we drew the line on the map, and now it's your responsibility to let people know that they won't get financial assistance if they haven't designed for it.
Is that also through like the insurance bureau of Canada, like, well, that resolution has to get a conference, so can homes like that, you can get insurance anymore?
There never really was overland flood insurance available in Canada. It started after the Calgary floods. It's generally not financially feasible for most people at PEI to consider it. There is one insurance agency of PEI that offers it, but it's an add-on, so it would not be included. The only way to get flood insurance covered on your home is if the water comes out of pipes instead of in the well. So insurance is something you can certainly look into and advise people to look into. It certainly is from a municipality advising people on being safe. It never hurts to say check your insurance agent, you know, what your coverage is, because you don't know what those coverages are or whether or not they're going to choose to purchase it. But you do know that the province doesn't have a choice on this. You know it because I've told you now. The maps exist, the floodplains are drawn, and if people choose to develop in those areas today and they don't design accordingly, they won't get financial assistance in the future. And that's a really big eye opener for a lot of people looking at buying property and considering development. The other issue with coastal hazards, I've mentioned erosion a few times, is that in your processes of evaluating permits and development applications, looking at infrastructure or property values, too many people are relying on GeoLink or just hand-drawn site plans. And I can tell you, as you know, someone that looks at properties on a very regular basis, those lines in GeoLink are not up to date, and the assessed land areas on properties are not based on actual land areas. So this property is out to Savage Harbor. Back in 1968, it had about 0.55 acres of actual land. Today, its assessed acreage is still half an acre, except it's measuring at 0.2. So if you're not getting up-to-date survey plans and actually measuring the land on the ground, how is it on site sewer and water wells going to fit 1.2 of an acre? So you have an obligation to actually know the size of the land that you're dealing with.
Yes, what do you think about tax and gain on full half an acre or the actual?
So property taxes are fine, they are we should have had a water. Back in 2016, we did what's called a cost benefit analysis and looked at the impacts of climate change on things such as the assessment values and whatnot. And assessments are really difficult to just say it's related to size when it's a developed property. If it's a vacant piece of land, it's based on size. And so you could request a reassessment based on loss of land if you're not in the same land area. As soon as you build on that property, the structure of the house actually dominates the valuation process of the property. So if this house has $500,000, or a property has $500,000 house on it, right? If they've lost half the land, the house value has actually gone up, and it works itself out in that, you know, just over time, valuations go up, right? So because of the structure, the land loss doesn't change it. Okay, so that was hazard number one, coastal hazards. I'm gonna walk through a couple more examples. Hopefully I'm not going far over time. Extreme weather. How do we actually do land use planning for a hurricane that's coming or those extreme rainstorms, right? So is your property or land use susceptible to wind or rain or extreme snow? And if yes, will the alterations in the grade of the land be impacting the stormwater flow? probably, right? If people start moving dirt around, changing elevations, it's going to change the direction of that water. Will increased hard surfaces change stormwater flow? Yes, because it no longer can go into the ground. And will the changes to the stormwater flow, because what we end up doing is directing everything out into the road, it'll impact our capacity of our infrastructure that we've designed for. Because what used to be a farmer field flowing in up those roads and into the stormwater system is now parking lots, right? So the amount of water into your system is based on those developments, even though the development is not directly related to the system. If not susceptible to those hazards, I'm figuring you're not in PEI, because y'all are susceptible. Or you're a really versatile individual. So if you're looking at something, for example, like Victoria Park, which floods all the time at high tide and during storm surge events, they just clean up the mess, seaweed and whatnot, and it pretty much goes back to normal. They have lost their boardwalk walkway during storms in early 2000s, but they've reinforced it. It, for the most part, will survive this weekend as well, right? But the park floods all the time. And we don't care about it because it's a park. It's not one of our homes. It's not our businesses. So versatile outdoor spaces, that's the accommodation piece of the protection, accommodate, and retreat. If we accommodate the hazard by being smart about what land uses we put in those areas, then we can be more resilient to them. So planning for extreme weather. Step one is always to recognize that the hazard is a problem. Step two is to establish a policy. You want to address that as a hazard to your community and that you want to improve circumstances for your residents. So some of the ideas of how you could do that is by identifying the areas of increased risk where we have overhead power lines, find the tree covers. And Zing can tell you all about combination hazards when you have power lines and trees coming down. Identify areas prone to stormwater drainage, ponding, and overflow. If you don't know where your problem is, how are you going to prioritize how to fix it? And whether it's a private property drainage issue or an infrastructure issue. If it is an infrastructure issue, make a priority infrastructure management plan. Decide what gets fixed first based on where your biggest problems are. You can require or incentivize new development to bury their power lines. I live in a community or a subdivision that's a wooded area, right? We have a lot of mature trees on the residential lots. And we didn't lose power during Dorian because we have one main line that comes up the street. And all the trees that fell in the neighborhood fell on our individual lots, and we have buried lines coming in from the street. That protected my entire street from losing power when many people were in for days, if not weeks. You can consider all season needs and backup power for your emergency reception center. So we're picking on Kensington, but they just put in a generator after Dorian, so their reception center will be prepared for a power outage. And so a reception center is the place that your residents will need to go in case of a long-term outage. But if you don't have power yourself, then what are you offering them in terms of respite? You could include a cleanup plan and a recovery plan for after the storm as part of your emergency management plan. When all the trees fall down this weekend, because they all still have leaves on them, and there will be trees coming down. Who's cleaning it up? Are we leaving that to just neighbors with chainsaws? Because that's usually what ends up happening. But as a municipality, you could coordinate an effort of pickup. You know, we're going to have trucks come down the street 2 days later, get your branches out to the curb, whatnot. Establish a neighborhood check-in program. So this is where small municipalities actually are probably strengthened by the value of knowing your neighbors. But in a lot of places, people that live alone or people that are vulnerable and have accessibility issues, they're the most vulnerable during these events because nobody's checking in on them and seeing if they've had damage to their property. And completely unrelated to the timing of the event, you could establish a tree planting program or tree protection replacement program to replace those trees that are lost when we do events. Such events.
Get back to number 9.
Yep.
I would like to see people who own generators in the town, so if they're up 3 or 4 days, people have a place to put the freezers. They won't lose their food.
Yep.
That's a big, big cost. Loss.
Yeah, and I mean, it could be a coordinated effort within the community of, you know, bring your foods in to this one location where we've got a generator running and got some refrigeration spaces. Most of the food banks now have generators in place, and I know as part of the good adaptation plan, that's something that we're proposing to ensure that food security is considered a critical or essential service that needs to be protected, not just our hard infrastructure. So, you know, it certainly is a cost to the individual homeowners, but it can be collectively coordinated as part of your emergency management plan, certainly. And I do think people genuinely want to help their neighbors during these types of events. And so if you have extra space in your fridge and you have a generator and you can let your neighbors know, if that's coordinated in advance, then people will know, otherwise they're just gonna lose food. So extreme heat, I mentioned it earlier, we don't talk about it enough. It isn't necessarily a land use thing, but it's really about us. It's about the vulnerability of people, plants, wildlife, and our natural systems, right? But when we think about land uses in terms of, is it an activity that's going to be susceptible to heat? Is it an older building that's being repurposed and doesn't have adequate insulation or windows or whatnot in order to offer cooling? Or is it an outdoor space like one of your public parks? It doesn't have shade or hydration station, so someone can refill with water bottles. There are lots of land use issues that rely on people's comfort, right? In order for them to actually use that space in a quality way, then they need to be comfortable even during a heat wave. If it's a brand new development, or if it's in the shade of trees, or if it's not being used in summer, heat may not be one of those risks, but you have to ask yourself, is this a hazard that impacts the decisions that we're making? This summer, we saw unprecedented days with heat warnings, and that will become more and more common. In PEI, we're fortunate that our heat warning index is actually lower than in other parts of Canada, but they've had longer to prepare and get used to the extreme heats. But in BC, they've showed us that they can far exceed what they're used to quite quickly and without much time to prepare. And BC is changing everything they're doing towards in terms of preparing for heat waves based on last summer's heat waves that more than 800 people died at. So if we recognize extreme heat as a potential issue to your community and establish policies to reduce the level of risk, then we can also identify the areas of risk due to outdoor activities. So as I mentioned, you know, if you have a soccer field in your community, how usable is it during an extreme heat wave if there's no shade, if there's no place for the kids to refill their water bottles? Or do you just have a policy for your recreation plan that says we shut down those types of activities during extreme heat? And that's an alternative as well, right? Older buildings in PEI, for the most part, do not have air conditioning. We're seeing a shift towards the heaters that are on the walls. Yeah, heat pumps, yes. That offer air conditioning. But the problem with putting a heat pump into an older home is if you don't have insulation, you're actually using up more energy than it's worthwhile. So you need to actually do a whole audit on structure before you just switch over. Ooh. Oh, so you can require or incentivize new development to maintain existing tree cover through tree replacement retention policies for new development. Tree cover provides shade, natural cooling, and heat studies in urban centers have shown drastic temperature differences between those streets that have urban street trees and just new development. It's just bare asphalt and front buildings. Planting programs. Stratford had a planting program for new developments last year, and I think they did it again this year. You can establish the neighborhood check-in program again. We're going to, you know, if it's already set up for the extreme weather events, use it in summer during an extreme heat event. Check on those elderly people that don't have air conditioning. How are they feeling during the heat wave? Heat waves are not physical injuries. They strain our bodies in ways that make people delirious. and can impact you over, gradually over a day, so you don't actually feel the sudden impact of it. And people don't even know it's happening time. And once again, consider the all-season needs of your reception center. Do you offer cooling as part of your reception center services? This is Daniel Cousins. He's from Charlottetown. 2 years ago, he created the Heatwave Heroes program and distributed stickers to businesses that were willing to fill people's water bottles for free. So that if you were a person, just a pedestrian on the street, or a person experiencing homelessness, if you're unhoused, where do you get your water? Just drink during a heat wave, right? And these are the businesses, they put the sticker in the window. You could walk in and get glass water free. And that's just one person's efforts to address a very critical service of hydration during a heat wave. Which brings me to my final topic, which is transformative climate adaptation. So everything I've said so far is about addressing a hazard, a natural disaster that's going to happen to us, and we've got to decide how we're going to prepare or respond to it. But complete communities are resilient communities. We are better prepared for climate change if we just plan better. So complete communities are an integrated approach in planning that builds local resilience and well-being by meeting the needs of people. It's a people-centered approach. What do your people need? Biggest problem I see currently in people's planning documents or their bylaws is everything's about property owners. Majority of the people in your community are not property owners. Your residents, your children, your people living in seniors' homes. They're your people that you need to take care of and who you have a responsibility for. And complete communities designed for all people. So it takes an integrated approach to municipal or provincial strategic planning, land use planning, infrastructure transportation planning, economic development, community design, and the provision of regional and local services. So that's where I mentioned before, if you are restricted by your capacity to offer services, take a regional approach, partner up, share resources, make sure that your people are taken care of, because the next community over may have something that you can offer and vice versa. Complete communities don't all look like town centers and cities. While it's easy to imagine what a complete community looks like in an urban center, in a rural community, it's just as important that you look at your transportation network and ensure that your residents have access to the service centers. And that requires the interconnectedness through the rural areas, right? We also have resort communities here in PEI, which have a very different priority in terms of economic development and addressing visitor needs. But they have a different responsibility in that sense too, because visitors are here during hurricane season. Dorian hit first week of September, right? And those visitors needed an emergency place to go. So planning for a complete community requires that people-centered approach, as I mentioned. We need to recognize that housing is a fundamental right to all people in PEI. And we need to address the housing crisis. The most vulnerable people to climate change right now are those who are unhoused. Where are they going to go? Which children has city, and I'm not going to get into politics around that right now. But where are they going to go when Hurricane Fiona hits on Saturday? Do we have enough beds for them? People thrive when the environment thrives. When we protect our environmental resources, our natural assets, our salt marshes, our shorelines, we protect ourselves. The environment will protect us if we leave it to do what it needs to do. The low carbon lifestyles of a complete community are more resilient because we're not all trying to get gas right when the gas stations are out of power. Food security is essential service. So look at your food system and your network. Where is your local store getting their food during a major event like a Dorian's or powers in 5 days? And the loss that can come with that, right? So if we prioritize those that are most vulnerable, the people who are already most vulnerable, rather than the people who own the second home on the coastline and who are planning down the road, right? Those people really aren't the most vulnerable. They have the most financial loss facing them, but they're not the most vulnerable for climate change. Then we will actually have more transformative adaptation. So to increase your housing opportunities, There are a ton of things municipalities can do. You can do it today. You don't need to wait for a housing strategy to promise to do it. Let's do it quick. Get people in homes. Recognize that the housing crisis is an issue. It's an issue across the whole country. You're not saying something people don't know. Increase your density in your core areas. We need density where people can access services. We need density where people have jobs, where they can get to the corner store, where they can get healthcare services. We need density where people can get on a bus. We need to encourage reduced lot sizes. Why do we have minimum lot sizes where people have services? If you have central services, it doesn't matter what your lot size is. If you put an apartment building on there or you put a single family home, why do we still have minimum lot sizes for single detached dwellings? People should be encouraged to build smaller. Permit secondary suites as right. If you have a single detached dwelling on a big lot, why shouldn't you be permitted to have an extra unit in that house? House more people in the same amount of space. Promote mixed use development. In your commercial cores, have residential upstairs. Encourage the development of smaller homes and lots, as I said. And recognize that institutional facilities, group homes, seniors homes, they are residential uses. When we zone things and require that a group home go on an institutional zone lot, there is no institutional zoning in your community for that group home to go to. But a group home is a home, it's somebody's home. Whether it's a child's home or an adult group home, it is a residential service. It should be able to go in a residential zone. If we reduce our personal vehicle dependence, we're designing for the 5-minute walk. We're reducing minimum parking requirements, promoting development of densities around transportation corridors. You can apply for funding, the new AT fund, to improve your sidewalks, your trail systems, and support home-based businesses, which will reduce the number of people on the road. Lots of ways that municipalities can get people off the road, and this also promotes reduction in emissions. And increase your development standards. The hardest thing for small municipalities to do is to say no to development. I know I've heard this. You want development because you want the tax dollars. So bad development is worse than no development. Because it's vulnerable, it's going to cost you in a long time, it's going to require upgrades to your infrastructure that you don't have the money to upgrade. So if you increase your development standards, then your development will be resilient. Promote interconnected transportation networks. We have enough dead end roads. Yeah.
That's not always necessarily true. Because if
Certainly.
you're already overdeveloped in one area
That's true.
and at the risk of saltwater intrusion, we don't want them to have secondary suites.
That's true. You're well, yeah, no, they if you don't have safe access to water, then you shouldn't be developing. That's right. Dead end streets. We have fire code regulations that limit the number of units, dwelling units on a dead end street, right? And we have that for a reason, because you don't want to have 300 people at a dead end and something happens and all those people stuck in their homes, right? So typically you think about that from a apartment buildings design perspective on a street with too many apartment buildings. But that same code applies to those floodplain areas where a road is within a floodplain. That's a dead end street, and all those people are in Hebrides, right? Are without emergency access if their road was flooded. It's also inefficient for service delivery. Garbage trucks, school buses. I live on a dead end street, and the school bus goes 15 minutes up the road to turn around and come back, right? It's just cost us all more because we're not doing interconnected communities, we're doing dead end streets on each individual farm field that's there. Restrict development of private seasonal roads, and that's the public safety side of little dead end streets in the rural areas. Private seasonal roads are not safe. Nobody builds a cottage anymore. Yes, we grew up with that idea of the dirt road that the farmers field to access your small seasonal cottage, and then you shut it down. But that's not the type of cottages being built these days. We have to stop lying to ourselves. If we sell a lot and someone has the right to build on it, they're gonna build a year-round home. You have to design that road accordingly. Undersized lots, and this gets to Stephanie's point. If it's undersized to meet today's standards for on-site services, why are we still building on them with the same types of storage systems, right? We can't continue to just allow those grandfathered in undersized lots to be developed to the same standards just because it was approved 30 years ago. It just doesn't meet. It doesn't make any common sense. If you require on-site services, we have to hold our ground and require a higher level of development and design for that site to be developed. But it may require central services. It may not be able to be developed until that can be offered. And we need to protect the vulnerable habitat and natural assets. Which is kind of funny that I left that to the very end, because that's usually what I spend that whole hour talking about is natural asset protection, the importance of nature-based solutions. Because we can solve these problems through nature-based solutions, but then always engineering, protecting our way out of it.
Get back to number 3.
Right. Like that?
Okay, number 3.
Yep.
On-site sewer. We had a problem in Stratford. People just could not open up their sewers or had inadequate sewer systems on their properties. And the groundwater got poisoned and it cost a lot of money.
Yeah.
Do you think that for a community to have a law or something in place that house is sold with a non-line with a sewer system in on the property that has to be pumped before the new owners vacate? Because that sewer system might be set for 5 years, the new owners come in, they don't pump it up, and they go another 5 years.
It's hard to base regulations around change in ownership because it's not something you monitor, right? So realistically, the change in ownership is likely not your measure of when that needs to be done. But you could have a bylaw that requires undersized lots to report that they're doing it on a regular, so many years basis, because otherwise they're contaminating their neighbor's wells, right? And so for the protection of everybody, Stephanie can definitely comment on this.
We have actually been working on a septic bylaw for the last years. We haven't finalized it yet because there's a lot of issues around the reporting and how do you get the reporting done and whether or not you want it for all lots or just undersized lots, but it is something we can work further.
Having said that, you know what we're gonna call it.
That is.
I just wrote that down.
Awesome, because maybe you can help with some of the challenges that we're hitting and maybe have different ideas or people to work with us to help us fix those challenges that we're facing. Because we're at a stalemate now, but there's a new council coming, so we never know what could happen.
And that's what's the wonderful thing about events like today, right? You have lunch together, talk about it, strategize, work together. And the more municipalities that kind of take the same approach, then your residents aren't fighting from like, well, that's not how Stratford does it. That's not how Charlottetown does it. And that's what people currently do, right?
Or who do you think you are, Charlottetown?
Yeah, exactly. And so, like, if we all work together, it's common sense that an undersized lot, it's too small to have on-site services today. But because it was approved 30 years ago, we're going to let it happen. And that's the current world that we live in. That's the current regulation. They let it happen because it's non-conforming and grandfathered in. It doesn't have less of a risk to the neighbor's wells. It doesn't have less of a risk to your groundwater source. And if your groundwater source to where your municipality is drawing water for central services, it's a risk to your whole community, not just the immediate neighbors. So with that, good planning has always been planning for climate change. Let's think bigger than the hazards. It's important to address the hazards and the emergency management, especially in the face of the storm that's hitting us in 2 days. So I hope you're all prepared for it and activated your emergency response. But think broadly with your planning and use all your tools in the toolbox. Thank you. It's been great.
Are we gonna deal with access lines?
Yes, yep.
Federation normally puts them on their website. But we'll figure it out. Yeah. Yeah. And I sent you messages off to my partner, made a presentation. With the ice, propane. Feeling, very on guard now for the emergency. So, yeah. I'm typically thinking about climate change from the mitigation perspective, which I'll get into a bit further in my presentation today, but it'd be nice to get the adaptation in as well. And so relevant for all of the municipalities that are represented here. My name is Kathleen. Figure out my mouse situation. Okay, so I'm Kathleen Mifflin and I'm here from Nova Scotia today. I work for Net Zero Atlantic. We are an organization that focuses on supporting research services, building knowledge, sharing knowledge, creating capacity that will allow Canada to transition to net zero emissions. The project that I have been involved with for the past couple of years that I'm going to speak to today is called the Atlantic Canada Energy System Model Initiative. And through this initiative, we are building capacity in Atlantic Canada to analyze intermittent pathways to net zero emissions through the tool of energy system modeling. Oh, I'm sorry. Sure, yeah, if anybody wants to go take a break, we can take 5 minutes and then come back.
Excuse me.
It was.
Switch over the adaptation.
That's really.
And it's like.
We could just follow the
Nothing, not a thing, just use sugar. So. Not see us later, I have to go. I have. We're gonna go that. I know that. Have barrel of fun with that one, yeah, so. Oh, we need to change it. We change it.
Yeah, lots of choices there this morning.
I love my text.
You're doing what?
Goal with a plan is not protecting. We have a plan for how we do that. Technically, it's a lot of ways, but
So we're wondering for potential workshops in the future, is there anything that stood out to you or anything you'd like to hear about?
Overland flooding mitigation.
The town of Stratford, what you call the ribbon mountain effect. The core of Stratford has been bought, all the land's been bought, and it's gonna be developed. But we got the council coming in, and we want somebody like Hope in there to say, okay, this is what you should be thinking of. The core. I mean, we have our planning standardized size, standardized plan, but we have to start thinking outside the box, have to start thinking creatively. I don't know if you guys have noticed, but anytime we put out a contract, to get something done, we can account, we budget a certain amount of money. They come back double, triple.
And I know that, the province has pushed forward the, requirement for all the other municipalities to have land use planning. But I still have a lot of anxiety and a lot of stress just over all these small municipalities going into planning, because we are not puny and we are struggling so much with planning just because, you know, we don't have the resources, we don't know who to reach out to. When we have a question, who do we go to? Something we don't understand. And when all these other municipalities, you know, are coming on, like, I'm just, we made so many mistakes, and I know that others are gonna make mistakes too. But how can we mitigate that? How can we help them before they're buried and going, we don't know what to do, we don't know what we're doing, you know, and I mean, obviously there's a potential to planners on that and then all that, so I don't even know how we can find development officers. I'd bring one from Lydia. So I don't know where they're gonna find them, and I know that they've extended it to 2025. I think it really need to be looking into this. You know, so it's and for the places that have planned right now, how can we get help? When we're stuck on something, where do we go? And I know that it would, you know, in a perfect world, we go to a consultant and the consultant would help us, but not everyone tell them. Like currently right now, we're doing a subdivision where we had to reach out to a consultant to help us. And we're now at like 3 times the amount they even paid for their subdivision of like permit to get, you know, for the subdivision. We've paid out almost 3 times that to consultant now already. And it's still not completed and we still have the legal and like it's costing us so much for them to have a subdivision. And it's because we just don't have enough resources.
So I think that's actually a really good point, and there's somewhat of a disconnect for me anyway, between what the ideal policy should be and what the financial capacity of municipalities on the island are capable of. And incentivize is a word that showed up quite a bit through the presentation. And I think when most municipalities are battling insurmountable infrastructure deficits as it is, how do we incentivize and most rural areas would be crying for development at this point, and burning property lines sounds like a fantastic thing to do. But when you're struggling to facilitate development in your community in the first place, how do you now tell developers that they have to take on 7 figures associated with burying property lines? So I think there's a financial component to this that, and not just a financial, I guess, a overall capacity component to relate back to everything that's kind of presented.
So, by the way, I don't really know anyone here. I'm Michelle Cabinet. So I'm with Eastern Kings as a development officer, so I'm new there. And also, I'm also on council with Surrey West, and was actually just speaking with my CAO saying, we don't have a municipal plan bylaws, and let's put that on the agenda, and we have to get starting to work on that. And I don't know who I'll be working with on that. And it sounds like we all have these same challenges. So I have challenges on the development side. I have challenges on the council side with the MPA and bringing in what we need to bring in. And we may be connecting with one another and supporting one another. The town of Surrey West got $25,000 on a project called Visions East. It was to facilitate the working together of the different municipalities going forward in our area. And we actually don't know who to contact, where to start, and what we want to offer, but it sounds like we have someone in our municipality that can receive funding to work with other municipalities, but we have no one to work with. We don't know who to speak to. So maybe we, as people in this room, we find ways to share resources, share our strengths, and work together and just talk to one another. When we had time.
Yes, we'll do that when.
But yeah, maybe we need to find, just maybe create our own tool.
Getting back to your question about finding owners. Believe it or not, we can wait 10 years. If we can get the high school system to opt into it, to have specialized classes that if somebody wants to become a planner or a carpenter or something like that, has specialized classes. Medical, doctors, nurses, whatever, put them in specialized classes that focus on what they need to do. That when they go to university, they're well prepared. They're coming out of high school now with a general education, and they're not subject to. We have to focus on the needs that we need and put those children in classes where they can focus on what they want to do, and then they're well set for university.
Well, I think our government needs to recognize that this is a profession, that this is a need, and if they've decided that all municipalities need to have one, then they need to help us get them. They need to recognize that this is something that they need to guide our going to school towards, so that we have planners in the next 2 years in 2025, when now their new date for plans required for all these towns. Or combine municipalities and make bigger ones so that they don't need so many big planners. Or one planner.
Like there are many professions and planning is one, and recently it's been illustrated. What I can suggest is that you can create a fellowship, which can be funded by the provincial level. You just have one planning school in Atlantic, Atlantic Transit, that's at the house. You can invite them to be part of this fellowship, and then we have professional, planners who are ready to work with municipalities.
I think another thing is if there is a way to recognize our credential, because I have a PhD in around that, with 15 years experience of teaching and 20 years of my own construction and planning company, but I could not practice here because I have to go through a very long and painful process. So why I have to do that? So I decided not to use that as skill. So for my own municipality, I'm looking for development officer as a plan.
Having said that, what can we do? What can we do to help you?
Because the federal government recognized my credential when I applied as a skilled worker, but the province never accepted it. They said I have to study and pass all the exams and do the mentorship for 2 years again. So it's still hard for me to do that and start from scratch when I'm not going to learn anything new. It could be a contribution to my knowledge and my experience. I would do that. And then the financial experience is going to cost me thousands of dollars. So it's not going to be something easy. It's like for the doctors, the surgeons, the nurse. But the federal government asked us to come to this country as a federal skilled worker. The provinces are not recognizing our credential is not going to solve the skilled worker shortage. So I think it's a higher level of policy that needs to be changed, like the other countries that they are taking advantage of the people who are trained without even one dime of financial strength of the country and using their skill and the experience to benefit of the country they live. So look, as all of the people are here in this island, they have so many things to offer, but they are not authorized to work and help or contribute to the community that they are living in.
But it's probably the most fractions and then what's this related to integration, because we really come to this point with skills and the skills, and the points are given on that basis. Whereas when you do come, your credentials are up. And that makes it difficult because then people actually have to go and do jobs, which is beyond, what they study for. That's another point in my opinion. Having said so, I think probably is, I can understand the complexities in medicine. With something like plan, architecture, something like engineering, I think this is something that should be an easy access. Exactly.
So ready for discussion. Just keep in mind time. Have to be here. Okay. Oh. I'll just do my presentation now.
Yeah, I didn't want to interrupt that. I want that. It was a very interesting conversation. Lots to think about, lots of important stuff. So hope that this will be a continuation of this will continue to be interesting, but in a different way. So we talked a lot about climate change from the adaptation side earlier this morning. As I mentioned, my focus is really mitigation. So I want to draw our attention to the context of mitigation. Think about the policies that are in place for PEI by 2030. PEI greenhouse gas emissions less than 1.2 megatons of carbon dioxide equivalents per year. And then by 2040, effectively net zero emissions. So we reduced our emissions and we balanced them out with negative emissions to the point where we achieved carbon neutrality. And so those are the goals of the province. They're actually quite ambitious in comparison to other provincial policy targets. The federal target being 2050 net zero emissions. So PEI is, I think, maybe one of the only provinces, or the only province to have a target for 2040 that's far ahead of the 2050 federal target. So this is the context in which we're operating. They are provincial targets, they're federal targets.
you know, here today, we're municipalities. But we all play a role in meeting these targets, and the way that these targets are met have implications for how we live, how we get our homes, how we get to work, how we run our communities and our municipalities. So I think you know, the stuff that I'm going to present on today is big picture. How do we meet those targets that are at higher levels of government? But thinking about all of the local impacts have also come along with meeting those targets, which are both ambitious but extremely important, given the context of what Hope shared with us this morning and the impending doom of Fiona as the second once in a lifetime storm that we're going to experience in the span of 3 years. Right. So when we think about meeting our climate change targets, obviously there's a lot of challenge ahead. So energy systems are growing increasingly complex and interconnected. So we're seeing the electrification of transportation, the electrification of heating. So that means that our electricity system has to be able to accommodate the needs of transportation and heating, where before they were sort of distinct sectors that weren't interconnected. We're also having distributed energy resources coming online, so solar panels, and that creates more complexity for a system that's been traditionally very centrally managed, especially in places like PEI and Nova Scotia and Newfoundland and New Brunswick. We're all similar in that we have a very centralized system as opposed to a decentralized, privatized. Well, I guess it is privatized, but it's not like Texas where we've got multiple companies that are to send their electricity over the grid. We also have technology disruption. So we have new technologies that are coming into play. And they all have their own unique benefits and costs that have to be considered. And there are also many unknowns. We don't know how the technologies will evolve over the next 20 to 30 years, right? We have some areas such as agriculture, which I'm going to talk to you a little bit later, where we don't actually have technologies that are going to abate our emissions. We don't know what the adoption rates of electric vehicles might be. And we of course have some control over that as well. And we can play around with that in models like the one I'm going to talk to you today. And we might have new technologies that come into our world that we couldn't have ever imagined today. And also things like population growth and climate change. How is that going to affect everything that we do? It's also important to keep in mind that emissions aren't just coming from one sector. So we have our traditional energy sectors, electricity, transportation, agriculture, transportation, and buildings. And they all use energy in different forms of energy in different ways. And outside of the traditional energy sectors, we have agriculture and industry. As you can see here, these are the major sources of emissions in PEI, as Hope mentioned earlier, transportation being the major one. And I think that really just, it stands out to us because PEI imports its electricity from, or a lot of it is electricity from New Brunswick, and so that carbon intensity of the New Brunswick electricity is accounted for in the provincial emissions. So that's why we see transportation really taking the main spotlight of sources of emissions, but electricity also being something that needs to be considered as well. So for all of these different types of emissions, there are distinct processes that create them. And so we have to also think about the distinct solutions that will apply to each of those processes. There is no silver bullet, unfortunately. And then we also have to move quickly. We're seeing the effects of climate change this week, and we need to be able to make those decisions quickly, but also to be transparent and democratically accountable. So a lot of factors that need to be considered when we think about how we are going to get to net zero emissions. And this is where energy system models can help. So they are as a general category, they are computerized models that represent the energy system. They formalize component parts of the system and their interactions and allow for a structured way of understanding the implications of reconfiguring our energy system. And we can think about energy systems on this graph. There are two sort of dimensions that we have here, which is time frame and level of detail. So there are lots of different types of energy system models. The ones that are on the right hand side and towards the bottom of this graph are very, very detail oriented. So these are tools that an electricity utility might use to manage load on an hourly or microsecond basis. And then towards the top, there is capacity planning, which this is really where we're focused because we're thinking long term. This is what a utility will use to build out an integrated resource plan, where they're thinking 5 years, 10 years, 20 years down the line. What are the demands that our energy system is going to face, and how are we going to most cost effectively respond to that with the infrastructure and the resources that we have available to us? And so that's really where I'm going to be focusing today. But there's lots of other ways that energy system models can help, and lots of different types of energy system models. So as I said, capacity expansion models is where we'll focus today. And what they do is they optimize the installation and utilization of energy technology capacity over a user-defined time horizon. Optimal decisions are driven by an objective function that minimizes the cost of energy supply. So that's really the goal of the capacity expansion model, is to give you the best system to meet your energy demands, if that will be most cost effective in doing that. So the math that sort of drives the model is designed to minimize the total discounting system costs, which consider things like capital costs, variable costs, fixed costs, and then also emissions costs. Given that we have regulated policies around carbon tax, et cetera, and we can subject that mathematical logic to a set of constraints which reflect the reality of our energy system on the ground. So technical constraints, yes.
I'm just wondering if we're going to be able to get copies of the slides.
Yeah, absolutely. So we have technical constraints that we're dealing with, like generator ramping limits. We have resource constraints. There's no natural gas pipeline to PEI. We have emission constraints, so when we put limits on our system, and we have policy constraints that we want to consider as well. So we might have something like a renewable portfolio standard, and this is something that Nova Scotia has regulated. By 2030, we have to have 80% of our electricity generated from renewable sources. So these are all things that a model can take into account when it's calculating the most optimal solution to the question that you pose to it. So this is the general question that our model answers. What is the optimal set of investment and operational decisions that ensure supply reliably meets demand, subject to a number of technical resource emission policy constraints? This is a network diagram, is what we call it, just to show you how all of the pieces of the puzzle sort of connect in the model. We start with energy sources all the way to the left here. So the actual fuel source, or the natural resource like sunlight, water, and those get transformed from left to right into commodities that are then fed to meet our demands, which might be things like lighting, cooling, cooking, and hot water.
Mm-hmm.
There is wind. This is just sort of an example network diagram that I pulled. So yeah, we would start here. We'll look a lot different for PEI and Nova Scotia. This is just an example from a website that's.
Sorry.
Oh no, it's okay. It's okay. It's a good question.
And I will bring this group up later because they play a big role in modeling work we do. Models use parameters to characterize the energy system. So for those of you who are familiar with any type of modeling, you know that models are they're models. They're not really good at giving us the full and whole truth, because they can't. They are abstractions of a very real system that's complex, and basically we do our best to abstract it into a system of equations. And so we have parameters that represent components of the energy system. And those things include things like capacity. So what do we have on the ground today in terms of the infrastructure that we've built out? What are the costs of that infrastructure and the cost of running that infrastructure? What is the demand that we're responding to? What is the discount rate? So we have to finance the infrastructure that we're building. Do we have emissions limits? Do we have activity maximum or minimum? So things like nuclear or coal, which can only run at a minimum. They have to be, if they're on, they have to be operating at a certain minimum level of activity. The reverse of that, you might have a hydro resource that has a maximum capacity because on a certain day of the year when it's not flooding, it has less that's coming through. So these are all ways that we sort of take part of the energy system and represent them in the model. Thinking back to some of those complexities that I listed earlier, this is how we can use models to respond to these different challenges that arise when we try to think about our path to net zero. So with the growing complexity and interconnection, when you take an energy system model and you represent all of the sectors of the economy, you can analyze the impact of electrification, of transportation and heating on the electricity sector. In terms of there being an increasing diversification of technologies that are available to us, we can use energy system models to compare and contrast different technologies and how they impact energy system costs. So we can look at solar versus wind, hydro versus natural gas. We can see what the optimal combination of those resources is to meet demands in an effective way, cost-effective way. In terms of there being any unknowns, this is a challenge for modeling because sometimes we don't have the data that we need to represent the system. But it's also, I think, an advantage in that we can use models to perform sensitivity and scenario analysis around those unknowns. So sort of what Hope had shown earlier in terms of the best case scenario and the worst case scenario for the floodplains. We can do that type of exercise with our mitigation models as well. Distinct approaches for different processes. So models that represent the whole economy allow us to see sort of the big picture and how everything's connected. Where are all of the distinct sources of emissions? Do we have solutions to address all of them? And what is the most cost-effective way of doing that? So we can create sector and economy-wide roadmaps for all sources of emissions. And then lastly, decisions needed to be made quickly, but also transparently, democratically. Models can be used to help us to understand how we can reach our long-term goals, to understand the system impacts of policy, and to provide rationale for policy decisions. So you might have a question for your provincial government. Why did you choose to support this development over this development? And they might have made that decision without doing any sort of modeling in the background, or they may have. And so this is why we want our model work that we do. We're trying to increase the transparency of decision making and encouraging people to use a single modeling resource or to share their assumptions and the background math that they're doing to make decisions that are going to affect our region for, you know, the next century. The infrastructure that we build today is going to be around, for the next 50 years. So we want to make sure that we are carefully evaluating those decisions, making sure that we will be able to meet the future demands on our energy system, and then we will be able to meet our climate change goals. So is it in this context that we built the energy system model, which we call ACES, the Atlantic Canada Energy System Model, to help us structure our understanding and response to questions about the nature of energy systems in Atlantic Canada. It is open source, as I said, because we believe in improving the transparency of decision making and planning for energy system changes and climate change. We hope to improve collective understanding and discussion, and we lead our region towards inclusive approach in decision making around the energy system transition. The ACES model is a long-term capacity expansion model. It includes all provinces in multiple sectors. So we have electricity, buildings, transportation, agriculture, waste, and industry, all represented. And the temporal resolution is from 2020 to 2055. So very long-term. We want to make sure that we're able to look at the horizon out to 2050 so that we can use this model to see how well and to what extent and at what cost we can meet our climate change goals. And it's fully open source. So that means that you can do a lot with it. You can change anything that you want. Yeah, I'll get into a little bit how you can use the model, but that's really not what I'm here for today. I want to talk mostly about the applications of the model. That's really what is interesting to discuss.
So could I just go back to that model?
Yeah. Well,
Needs amongst the provinces is a complicated issue. For example, getting electrical power from Newfoundland, Churchill Falls, and now there's Muskrat Falls is another dam that's planned, I think, on the it's on the eastern side of Newfoundland. So those agreements, federal provincial agreements, how does ACES try to override those agreements?
they're all built in.
They're built in?
Well, like we would assume that we have this much electricity that we can import on an annual basis from Quebec. And we've got the maritime link represented. So that the link from Newfoundland and Labrador to Nova Scotia. We have Muskrat Falls represented. It's really a tool that's extremely flexible though. So you can remove those policies and see what the model does to meet energy demand. We could look at PEI and say, absent any imports, well, how does the PEI system respond to local energy demand? We actually, as a team, did an analysis of the Atlantic. So I unfortunately don't have that to share today, but we have looked at the Atlantic Loop with this model to try and understand, okay, what are the cost implications? Like, are there other ways of achieving our climate change goals in a cost-effective way without the Atlantic Loop, right? So without importing electricity from Quebec, how does that impact our ability to meet our goals? What does it mean for wind development? There's really so many different ways we can frame the questions, but that is exactly the type of topic that you would explore with a model like this.
So is NB powered lines from Hydro-Quebec?
To my understanding is that, there is a certain amount of electricity that's already imported into the system from Quebec today. But depending on how negotiations around the Atlantic move forward over the next couple of years, we could be signing ourselves up as a region for importing, I think, quite a bit more electricity from flow back through New Brunswick, which then comes into Nova Scotia and PEI.
So, around the world, there's starting to be talk about the small nuclear power plants.
That's right, yeah.
Like up north, isolated areas where it's hard to get electricity into. Is that on your radar? And before somebody starts yelling and screaming, remember aircraft carriers, submarines had nuclear power plants for 50 years. Right, so it's workable.
Yeah, so that,
But is that something we should be looking at?
it's one of the things that we can look at in a model like this. We actually have a student who's doing some research now on, she's looking at burnt hydrogen. So we're digging into what hydrogen economies look like in Nova Scotia. But we also do know that small modular reactors are being deployed at pilot scale in New Brunswick. And so that's her next topic that she's going to dig into. And it is of interest to Nova Scotia, like government as well, or at least to the extent of, seeing that as a technology that's represented in the model. We had a lot of people, we're a year out from getting our engagement with stakeholders after we built the model. And that was one of the things that came up quite a bit. What about small modular reactors? What about small modular reactors? So the model, again, being super flexible, you can add or remove technologies to your life. So there's so much flexibility, and that is a technology that can be represented. It's hard though, because our future cost projections are terrible because it's a technology that hasn't really been built yet.
And we get the people to service.
Yeah, yeah.
So I was kind of asking what my question is sort of saying. I was thinking about, does the model take into account like the aging infrastructure at say Next Dam, or possibility of conversion of validated from coal? Like, does it look at that and sort of like look at the political will around those kinds of things?
Yeah, those are all things. So each of the technologies that is included in the model, there's a parameter for lifetime. So you can make that lifetime as short or as long as you want to. I think we have a set of assumptions that like wind turbines are, it's 25 years, and there's the issue of point load approach. And I think they went back to the review board in New Brunswick and said it can open until 2047 instead of 2040.
We're good with that, and also
You could look at that, you could look at Belgium, you could say, yeah, what are the costs of changing it over?
Okay, so that does.
Yeah. So there's this is the challenge with this type of presentation, is trying to, it's a whole world that we could go into, and I will show some examples, but I'm really glad that we have these questions, because this is good, to demonstrate what the potential applications are. So we built the model with a team of researchers. We have a consultant do the actual work, but we worked alongside a group of researchers from across the world, really. So people who specialize in energy modeling, some folks from out west, so Dr. Tom Yet at SMU, and then Daniel Hutman, actually all the way in Austria, Sally Benson at Stanford University, and then we had some more local folks involved, a couple of Dow professors and an SC professor. And we also did a lot of consultation. So this is probably outdated. We've probably talked to our people since then, but we really wanted to get people's perspectives on the work that we were doing, and to get their feedback so that we can make a model that was better to local interests. And that's really the purpose of this exercise too, sort of to hear what people are interested in and see what we can do to meet their needs better with the model and the work that how we apply the model to look at critical energy topics for our region. The model itself is built using an architecture that's called TMOA. This is the website I was supposed to talk about earlier. It was developed by Dr. Joe DeCarolis at North Carolina State. He's actually now the administrator for the U.S. Energy Information Administration. So we feel like he probably did a good job, and we feel good about the map that runs the model. And this model, TMOA, is the basis for the well-supported initiative in the U.S., which is called Open Energy Outlook. So they kind of they kind of do similar work that we do in that they're trying to use this model to MOA and see it applied by various, university organizations, policy makers across the United States.
So with regard to the inputs, are they calculated or put in by each user, municipality, province, or whatever? How are they calculated? Are there commonly accepted numbers that are
Yeah.
available to be used for the inputs?
It's a good question. And yes, we pre-populate it with data. Yeah, so that was really the main exercise. Like we have the map, we have the Tomoa, which is the model box. Some of the code and some data different functionalities to the model code, but most of our exercise was collecting regionally represented data. Yeah. I guess I really need to talk about that diagram. Sorry about that. Skip right over. So once you get your regional energy system data input to the model, and you can formulate the questions you have, which is you do that by creating a specific scenario or several scenarios that you want to analyze, and then it'll give you, your feasible model solutions and some data visualizations. So this is a sort of spectrum that I like to use to explain the different types of users that we might have. We're still new at this, so we're still learning who our users could be and how they might use the model. We initially set out really excited that it would be more broadly used by a lot of different stakeholders, but we soon realized that the original version of the model actually runs on a desktop in a Python environment, and it's not super accessible. So you might be really good at using models already, and so if you're one of those people, then you would probably fall into the left side of the spectrum as a modeling expert. And so we do have people who are playing around with the model in this format, and they're students who are in energy focused research areas. They're government modeling personnel who really know how to use models and have familiarity with the technical environments in which you have to run a model on a computer. We've also created a web-based interface, which allows you to interact with the model through like a web application. It still requires you to have a pretty good understanding of how to create scenarios in like an Excel-like file, and to be able to analyze those. And so we see people falling into that category in the area of policymakers, maybe social science researchers, and NGO staff. And then we have our website with educational resources, which is still directed towards the general public. Increasingly, what we're thinking is that we might have we're sort of falling in between web-based and website, and that we might have sort of actual scenario analysis reports that we put out for people to read and understand. So another category of people who don't actually get in and create their own scenarios and analyze them, but want us to do that, and then we share the results of that work. These are two sample scenarios that I just want to show, just to show you what the outputs look like, and how you might construct a scenario in a model like this. They're very simple example scenarios, and yeah, their outputs are not meant to be like analyzed further, just because they're very, very simple. We do that to illustrate the differences between the scenarios and how the model responds to different things that you tell it. So our baseline scenario, we have a federal coal phase out by 2030, no carbon tax applied, and no CO2 emissions applied. And then our CO2e limit category, we have a federal coal phase out by 2030. There's no carbon tax, but we do have our announced provincial CO2e limits imposed, and this is zero CO2 limit for all provinces except for New Brunswick, which their legislated goal is to have 5 megatons by 2050. So this is what the output from the model looks like. We have a capacity model. So capacity being basically the infrastructure that's built out, the number of gigawatts of a certain technology that are built out on the ground. And we can see between these two graphs, there's really not a big difference, except for once you get to 2040 and 2050, which is when our climate change policies come into play. And so
2050 being when most of the provinces have to reach net zero, because the model is not told any point between 2030 and 2050 that it has to do anything different except for PEI here. It's rapidly building out infrastructure. It's rapidly electrifying our transportation and our heating sectors, and then it's building out a ton of capacity to meet those increasing demands. So this is probably not a real life, scenario of how this would play out. We would hope, right, that we would have planning processes, as Hope was talking about today, where we would shift more of that transition to be, occurring 2030, 2035, 2040, 2045. And so we could use policy to change the way that our system evolves. Because if we leave it up to one single CO2 emission limit, most cost-effective way for us to beat that limit is to do it in the very last year. But is that actually feasible? Probably not. So yeah, there's so many different things that we could do. We could play around with technology adoption. We could say, let's say we have electrification by 2035 of all home heating in PEI. What does that look like? And is that feasible? And if it's not feasible, what's the next 5-year time span that we can analyze? Yeah, I'm gonna move on to the next one. So I could go on for a while. And then we look at generation here. So this is the actual activity of our electricity sector. So we have all of our infrastructure built out. How is that infrastructure operating on a daily basis to meet demands that we define for it? So over the two graphs, you can see again, it's pretty similar, except for when we get to 2050, where we can't have any emissions happening. So we have to have in this year, there can be no resource that's still being used that generates emissions. So we have natural gas still, but it's with CCS. Obviously that's a topic that, is debated. What the actual capacity of carbon capture and storage are. And we also have bioenergy carbon capture and storage coming into play. And this starts coming into play 2040, which makes sense because that's when our PEI limit comes into effect. And what the model is effectively saying to us by showing us that it's using bioenergy carbon capture and storage is that it needs negative emissions to meet the demands, or to meet the demands and to meet our targets. We assume, and this is an assumption, right? It's assumptions that we have to be clear about. We assume that bioenergy carbon capture and storage is a negative emissions solution, assuming that you have a zero impact with your tree that you've grown, or actually you've taken emissions out of the atmosphere with that tree that you've grown, and then if you combust it using carbon capture and storage, then your emissions are going to be negative. And so that's why we see it coming into play really strongly in those last few time periods. So now I'm just going to go into a few potential applications of the small PEI. There's so many different ways that we could use the model, but I tried to come up with a few potential examples that might be interesting to the types of energy challenges that the PEI is facing. So one of the topics that I think is really interesting really depends on what PEI intentions are in terms of how much electricity it wants to generate on the island and how much it will import from other provinces. So if the policies dictate, or the people who influence policy dictate that PEI will become more of a supplier of its own electricity, then there needs to be an acknowledgement of the fact that renewable energy takes land. It is way more land intensive than fossil fuel based resources. So the build-out of renewable energy infrastructure would need to be considered in the context of other land uses in PEI. So we have a modeling opportunity here, which was to analyze the land use impacts of meeting provincial climate change targets and other policy goals. And this is, I think, one of the top affects municipalities more than any of the other examples that I'll talk about today. So we haven't done this yet with our models, but I want to give an example of a study that did this. They investigated the emission reductions pathways for the electricity supply system in Alberta while viewing land area as a constraining resource. So actually thinking about land as a resource. They constrained land through two different degrees. You can see in these graphs here on the left, again, that's capacity. So what is the actual infrastructure that's built out? And then production. So how are we utilizing that infrastructure? And the left scenario, the left bar is if we don't constrain land use, how does the model respond to climate change targets? And then all the way to the right is if we don't allow our system to see any land area increase, what is the most optimal system configuration? So when we restrict land use, we see an earlier expansion of spatially dense technologies. And so those are things like rooftop solar. You can see rooftop solar is really, really coming into play in those scenarios on the right here, because they seem to take up a lot less space than ground solar or wind energy. We also see the build of more costly renewable technologies like geothermal. And so that's obviously a more viable technology for Alberta than for PEI. But what this is saying is, well, if you don't let me build out solar or wind because of the land use implications, then I have to build out more costly renewable technologies to meet those same goals. And as a result, you see an increase in cost. So constraining land use in this instance increase the costs of the systems in meeting climate change targets. And overall, we see a decreased share of renewable energy and instead an increased share of low carbon energy, so natural gas with carbon capture and storage, which again is more of a costly solution than wind and solar, which are quite cost effective.
Kathleen, is this based on the assumption that we have centralized grid system?
Yes.
What happens when there is decentralization of grid system?
That I'm sure can be modeled, but I think it would be hard to model it with the model like this.
Well, the whole version. Yeah, sorry. I asked if this assumption is with, it's a spaced model based on assumption of centralized grid system. And what happens when there is decentralization of the grid system? For example, like the cell site, they have their own system, own generation. What if municipalities have their own breakers? I know this is very controversial. We have Maritime Electric having the monopoly over the infrastructure. What if situation, if there is decentralization, let's say Stratford owns its own, infrastructure and transmission and, generation. How would that, how that change the?
It depends on whether or not that infrastructure was used to meet just local demands, or it was also used to meet provincial. So is it something that sort of can be generated on the ground in Stratford and then put onto the grid, which then responds to provincial electricity?
No, not the condition.
Okay. Yeah, so that is a bit more challenging to analyze with a model like this.
I'll rebut that a little bit. We in towns and cities buy expertise in companies, policing, firefighting, maritime electric. We hire these people on to provide electricity for us. They provide the skilled workers, the expertise in order to get electricity to our houses. We're willing to pay for that. Because if we had to buy our own people, service these stuff, it's very, very costly. And of course, there's a lot of movement of employees down to down. So I think in our system, what we do is that we buy the expertise and let them run. And that's how we do.
Right, right, yeah, and so in that case, this is the right model for analysis in terms of understanding, like I think about land use in the context of the municipality. We might not be able to run this model to look at municipal energy issues, but we would be able to say, oh, well, Stratford has to have a really good solar source, and what happens if we, to restrict land use in another area, and then, so there's lots of ways that you could interact with a model like this to understand impacts that affect you at a municipal level, but it's not good at answering the types of questions that status housing in terms of what about decentralized energy systems. There are other types of models that do that. This one isn't so good at that. Have to be fully transparent about that. The other thing that's really critical in PEI is agriculture. So think back to the nice graphic that showed the major sources of emissions in PEI. Number 1, transportation. Number 2, agriculture. This is an agricultural province. So it's not typically included in energy system models because the provinces that emit GHGs in this sector are largely distinct from other sectors. Cows are not running on electricity. We can't electrify them either. So yeah, very, very distinct challenges in this sector. And that's why they're typically not included in energy system models, but we do include it in our model because we want to make sure that we fully account for all of the emissions that we're dealing with in our region. And some other models have done this, and I'm going to speak to an example the next slide. So a modeling opportunity here is to analyze how the agriculture sector can contribute to meeting economy-wide net zero goals, whether it's through technological abatement measures or nature-based solutions like soil management practices, and or how other economic sectors can help mitigate GHGs within the agriculture sector. So if we don't have solutions available to us to mitigate agricultural emissions in the agriculture sector, what else can we do?
Okay, so cows, we always point out towards cows, but we have pigs, we have chickens, we have humans, right?
Yeah.
Is there waste also counted in this, or is it just specifically to the methane and the cow?
We have a waste factor that's represented.
Okay.
Yeah. And pigs are counted in here too, in the agriculture sector. So there was a group in 2016 that integrated the agriculture sector in Ireland with an energy system model in order to assess how emissions reductions via technological, to assess the potential for emissions to be reduced through technological abatement measures in the agriculture sector, but to also gain insights into the dynamics between the energy and non-energy systems in response to GHG targets. So this is just sort of an abstraction as to how they did that. So they had their main energy system model piece here that plugged into the agriculture sector, which was represented in 3 main technologies: livestock, tillage, and feed crops, and which then met service demands for livestock and tillage. So it's a bit of a strange way to represent the agriculture sector, but that's sort of how it fits into the energy system framework. And when looking at number 2, so we're thinking about dynamics between those 2 sectors. The model is making the most cost-effective decisions to meet its goals and its demands. And there's really not a lot of technological abatement measures for the agriculture sector. And if they are available, they're not super cost-effective. So the model in this case ended up really prioritizing emissions reductions in transportation, agriculture, and building sectors where we have readily available and relatively cost-effective solutions. So the agriculture sector sort of there's just not a lot of things that are available to us to make those reductions. So reductions have to happen elsewhere. But when we think about net zero, that means no emissions, or at least no emissions that are above net zero. So when they looked at the scenario of trying to meet 80-95% emission reduction by 2050, it just wasn't feasible. Because there are no technological abatement measures that can completely reduce the agriculture sector emissions. So there has to be other things that we're thinking about. There has to be negative emission solutions. And they didn't really look at that in here. They didn't think about nature-based solutions that could, suck out carbon. They didn't apply direct air capture, which is a fantastic magical solution in the future that maybe we'll be able to help us with these types of emissions and continue to put the investment into that, the development of those solutions. An important finding, not one that's super fun to think about, but also very, very important in the context of PEI's 2040 net zero goal. So that means that we have to have a solution, or many solutions that will be able to counterbalance emissions that we still have coming from the agricultural sector.
PEI Climate Lab, you're working with those people?
Yeah, we actually have a PhD student who is working with us now to improve some of the agricultural data that we have.
They're working on similar stuff, are they not?
Yeah, they look at adaptation and mitigation. They're looking at like soil management and nature-based solutions for sucking like carbon out of the atmosphere.
And what about the Amish and the Buddhists? Have you contacted them because of their farming rates?
Why?
Because of the way they farm?
Oh, okay.
They,
Just like there are groups of Amish and Buddhist farmers in PEI.
big time.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Okay, good to know. This really touches on the topic that Hope was getting at today, which is that, yeah, our land, our winds, our temperatures will change because of climate change. So that has implications for our energy system too. So this is a fun example where adaptation meets mitigation. So we're thinking about how is climate change impacting us? How are we going to mitigate climate change? So how are we going to reduce our emissions, but also be prepared for the impacts that climate change will have on the energy systems that we build out. So we might have increased cooling demand. So that's something that we need to have our energy system prepared for. And then what are the implications of that? If we have more cooling demand in the summer, do we need to have more wind turbines? That's those are the sorts of things you could explore a model like this. There's also decreased heating demands, changing wind speeds, and then reduced land mass for energy development. So we could look at the optimal energy solution for PEI and how it differs when future climate impacts are accounted for. A study in Norway looked at this with their, they took global climate models and emission scenarios. So this is, these are the projections for climate change and how they could impact weather systems. And they brought it down, so downscaled it to Central and Northern Europe. And they used that data to characterize potential end-use demands for heating and cooling and resources. So they looked at hydro and wind resources and how they would be different based on these projections for atmospheric climate conditions, and plug that into their energy system model to get the cost optimal energy solution. They saw that there was increased hydropower capacity in the future. So as a result, there was less investment in offshore wind. Hydropower being a more cost-effective solution. The increased hydropower capacity and reduced electricity demand, which because there was a reduced heating demand, they saw increased cooling demand in the summertime, but not to the same degree that they saw reduced cooling, reduced heating. So that meant that they actually had a reduced demand for electricity overall, and an increased supply of electricity, which effectively lowered electricity production costs and allowed Norway or put Norway in a position to increase their electricity exports. So those reduced electricity production costs came into play as well when we looked at adoption of EV and hydrogen vehicles. So the cost effectiveness of technology adoption that relies on electricity is going to be influenced by the cost of electricity. So with a reduced electricity price, the model took the step to adopt EVs and adopt hydrogen vehicles earlier. And hydrogen vehicles being indirectly influenced by the cost of electricity because the hydrogen is produced through electrolysis, which takes electricity, runs it through an electric current, and takes water, runs electric current through it, and gives you your hydrogen. All right, I think I have a couple more examples, but I'm gonna do one more example and then call it. So transportation, a big one for PEI again. When, how, and how much electrification of transportation occurs will profoundly impact the energy system. The reverse of this is also true. As I was just saying, the cost of electricity production and associated emissions impact when, how, and how much electrification of transportation occurs. So we might say if we quickly electrify electric vehicles in electrify vehicles in Nova Scotia, we still have coal. So our emissions are going to be higher. But if we wait till 2030 to really ramp up our electrification, our emissions will be lower. But maybe it will be more costly, depending on the price of meeting electricity demands at that time. Other constraints that we want to consider, like infrastructure and consumer buy-in, will also impact the speed of adoption. And we can model those things, play around with them in our model. So a modeling opportunity would be to analyze pathways to decarbonizing the transportation sector when we account for things like adoption constraints. And we can also characterize the impacts of electrifying transportation on other energy sectors like electricity.
In regards to electric vehicles, provincial government has put in a lot of active transportation rates.
Right.
But with that, we have electric bikes, no problem, but electric scooters, and they are flying. We have a problem with the speeds.
Interesting.
Yeah, and on the streets, just zigzagging through.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Yeah, but we don't have electric. Yeah, I don't know. What are the helmet laws in PEI? Okay, so yeah, I don't know. This is just occurred to me.
You're supposed to wear a helmet to try to catch them.
Okay.
Not gonna happen.
Nova Scotia has helmets. We don't have those like the Pixie bikes they have in all the other cool cities like Montreal and Ottawa. Anyways. So this was an example again in Alberta. They looked at the implications of vehicle charging profiles on the most cost optimal way to meet electricity demand. So 5 scenarios I'm gonna quickly go through. So in the reference, there was no alternative fuel vehicles. So it was internal combustion engines, internal combustion engines all the way. In this scenario, the electric vehicles could only charge at night. In this scenario, the load charging took place throughout the day. And then this one, the vehicle could only charge during hours of daylight. And then the last one, heavy-duty transportation demand is met by hydrogen fuel cell vehicles. So this is heavy-duty transportation, not passenger vehicle cars. So charging vehicles at night increased the use of gas turbines and wind generation because solar is a strong resource in Alberta. There's no solar at night, so when we try to charge our cars at night, we're not able to take advantage of that cost-effective resource. If charging vehicles occurs during the day, the solar generation nearly doubles. So you can see this scenario versus this scenario, we're getting a lot more solar being used in the system. This results in additional backup capacity to meet reserve constraints. So the model actually says that because there's so much solar, I need to increase my applying capacity overall so I can meet reserve margins for the electricity system. And then hydrogen from fuel cell vehicles, the assumption is that it can be generated anytime during the day and stored. So if heavy duty transportation demand is met by fuel cell vehicles, more solar electricity generation occurs. So the model is saying it's cost effective for me to consume solar energy during the day, store it up, and then fuel cell vehicles can be charged whenever. So this is the last example I'm going to lead you today. We're running into lunch now. So I did have okay. This is the new tool that I'm my computer too, I think. So if you would like, you can participate in this exercise. So we talked about several topics today when it comes to our energy system transition. My question for you is, what are some other topics in addition to the ones that I discussed that would be of interest and use to your team or department?
Transition strategies and costs. And the cost of retrofitting and
Just gonna write it down. My note taker kind of leaves, so.
transition opportunities and costs and strategies of working with jurisdictions including that in the model somehow. Because right now it's an ideal world scenario, whereas there are a lot of vehicles and infrastructure that is based on old technology. We still use
Upgrading
how
infrastructure.
do you get efficient, migrate from the old.
Yeah, absolutely.
Your last slide there, we were talking about solar energy. Nothing that used to be first. It's a model of the battery storage.
Yeah, it has battery storage as an option.
So a battery storage system that would store all that energy and then transfer all the units.
Yeah, it's sometimes more cost effective to charge directly. Like that's what the model would tell you, is that if you can get the electricity straight from the grid, rather than having to store and charge back later.
Yeah, I know, like, if your vehicle would be used during the day,
Right.
so
Yeah.
charge during the night.
Yeah, which is why you can set that as a restriction. I'm not sure if they included battery storage in that study.
But there's players that gives you an opportunity too, so the parking rides have EV, like, have
Yeah.
charging stations.
Yeah,
at parking
exactly.
lots.
Exactly, yeah, and it depends on the resources that you're using, so PEI is, I think, a really good solar resource in PEI, but there's probably a lot of wind too, which is I think less tied to like day and night time, so this is a particularly salient example for Alberta, because they're really, interested in solar. But this is the type of model again that you can use to look at what are the patterns of energy generation in PEI and how do we align our charging profiles best, and what can municipalities do to support that.
And the reason I brought that up is we're open electrification of our transit system. The only way to keep the demands on the electrical system low, would pay that would be astronomical, because they have an actual battery storage system that would charge plus your heat.
Yeah.
And that demand lower. It still hasn't charged the grid,
Yeah,
but battery would offset, so you can. get the
Okay.
demand curve.
okay. Yeah, no, I think that is something that we talked about when we created this model, was that, they're obviously for passenger vehicles, there's more flexibility for things like buses that have to run during the day, trucks that have to drive during the day, that have.
More funding of. And these programs, switch programs, Charlottetown and ourselves, it's a massive hit. The more funding opportunities we can get, better off we're going. And that means everybody, every municipality.
Yeah, adaptation and mitigation alike, sure.
I'm wondering what's the strategy or policy to improve low income families? You're talking about EV chargers, refrigeration, and building solar farms. All of this is for the upper middle income and high income families. How are they going to do about the low income families? People who need to buy old cars to travel around, people who need to rent really old homes that they do not have the proper climate change metrics that is going to limit or optimize energy usages or other things. All of these things really fancy things for the rich people. And I can see anything for the people who are kind of unfortunately growing in numbers in our communities.
Yeah.
And as far as I know, there is no law that forces the old cars off the roads. We tell them, okay, you cannot buy a Ford Polo, it's not a EV charger, kind of, or it's not kind of really fuel efficient that you are going to use it. So all of these things are perfect if you are going to consider the inclusive community. All of the social problems are good.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree with that. This model isn't great at telling us the impacts to the individual, told us the system costs as a whole. And it's for long-term, high-level planning that of course have the impact of that level. Ways that you can of course incorporate those things into this model is either to do a separate study to analyze what are the barriers for adoption of vehicles in communities, how can we address those challenges, and what are the costs of doing that. And then we feed that into the model and say, yeah, we can only adopt this many electric vehicles at this cost, but beyond that, there has to be some incentive. There has to be there's a cost to ensuring that adoption is successful, which doesn't necessarily it means that the model would maybe choose to not do that if we're talking about this is a model that costs. So there's a cost to the system to increase transportation electrification, then it might not do it as readily. The cost isn't always the objective, right? And so we can tell the model what to do, right? We can say you have to make this demand, you have to do these things. But if you don't tell it to do those things, then it will cost optimize. But that's the beauty of the flexibility of the tool, is that you have control over how you design your scenarios. Okay. I do have one more slide that if you're interested in the participate in. Again, it's just a question on the topics that we discussed today. I didn't get to deep reductions, but yeah, those are the implication of deep reductions is really when we go beyond the things that are so low hanging fruits. How do we completely mitigate our emissions against net zero? What are the more challenging reductions that we have to achieve?
First three, then we shall help from climate.
Really estimated $1,000 in figures, how much money would cost the PEI? Anyways, like what's the dollar figures, especially with this model?
You're using it?
Yeah, like what's the cost to on
There's no, it's free, it's open source.
No, I mean like
30.
the cost, the total cost of like example, switching to EV. Do you have like you have texture? Have you modeled that like this?
That's good. But we actually did apply for some funding with the Environment Climate Change Canada group to look more into how do we change human behavior to influence technology adoption, to reduce energy demand, to reduce consumption of carbon intensive food products. And the goal of that is to also look at costs of those things. But they're big problems. And it's hard to how do you predict what adoption will be based on the constraints that you have? We don't have that data. Or we haven't fed it into the model yet, but it is a challenge. Yes. All right. I don't know if there's results. Oh, okay, everybody really liked everything. Great. That's really helpful. All right, I'll 15 minutes pass, so I'll let everybody go and grab lunch. It should be ready outside.
Yeah.
Actually. I know. I have these ones. That's okay.
Cents and dollars. It's a student. Sure. In the water.
Oh, so they, what? There's some, there's a five or six different. Yeah. We were. You did and not that. And we don't want the application is.
Yeah. With a model like this, the requirements.
For sure. Well, we used to have your. Oh, yeah. They're dropped. Like, you guys are growing 20 years. Well, so the guy- yeah, the other day. And was great.
Oh. So I did not see $5. No, you don't want to buy. Yeah. We looked at what we have to do about this. Differential and multiple. We tried.
It was one of the.
This system.
It's just, it's
So. Is there some?
You know, well, issues on.
That's right. It's, oh, yeah. Anytime now. I'm sorry, I didn't pick the new part. They don't live here, yes.
That one's open. Okay.
I haven't, but I go with that challenge. I haven't, like, I don't. I think it's like with that. So
No, he'll stay. You don't know, but definitely. Yeah, that's much. Would definitely. Yeah. Whenever I. That's a lot. Silver. New.
This first I'm gonna go through.
He doesn't need to be on it. Well, I know he's sore. We were sore 7 days ago, so. Yeah.